Coming up on today's episode of Parasport Nation, Dr. David Legg is back. He's going to talk about sports being included and excluded from the Paralympic Games. Let's get started.
Welcome to Parasport Nation with Alex Smyth and Nathan Clement.
Welcome into Parasport Nation. I'm your host, Alex Smyth, as always joined by co-host Nathan Clement. Nathan, how are you doing today?
I am doing great, Alex. Getting really excited. Got race season about to kick off, but there's also so many sports going on right now. It was just Masters weekend, so I don't know if Rory McIlroy had any of our dream championship meals. We'll be planning that for next year, but there's just so much happening, and I cannot wait to share what's going on in the Parasport update.
Well, Nathan, without further ado, take it away, and here's the PSN update.
Now, the PSN update.
La Belle Provence witnessed the conclusion of the Canadian Wheelchair Basketball League Finals. 16 teams whittled down to 2 champions in Division 1 and Division 2 action in Montreal. Led by Jonathan Vermette, CIVA defeated the Alberta Northern Lights to win Division 1, while Agels de Valleyfield bested 46 North in Division 2 title fight. In the lower 49, the NWBA's King and Queen of the Courts have been named. The Marquette Eagles ended a 23-year drought to claim the championship in a 66-62 victory over the Dallas Mavericks. Crossing the Americas, we touched down in the land of poets, Chile, for Boccia World Challenge action. In the BC4 men, Julian Sabanu seized gold, while Alison Levine claimed silver in the BC4 women, and Alexander Lemaire took silver in men's BC3. Back to wheelchair basketball. After impressive seasons, Caddy Dadino has been named Female Athlete of the Year, and friend of the program, Patrick Anderson, won the men's honor. And that's the PSN update.
Obviously, a well-deserved honor for Patrick Anderson to end his career with one last accolade. Very much well-deserved. But we have to keep moving on because we have a jam-packed and fascinating conversation with Dr. David Legg. He is the past president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee and professor of sports management and adaptive physical activity at Mount Royal University. He joins the show to discuss the challenges and the logistics of adding and removing sports from Paralympic Games and the impacts they can have. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. David Legg. Dr. Legg, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good to see you guys again.
Yeah, it's always great to have you on. You're such a wealth of knowledge. And so today we really want to pick your brain about the inclusion and exclusion of sports from the Paralympics. So my first question is obviously, why do sports get added and removed from the Paralympics in a seemingly regular fashion? It seems like every other cycle, there seems to be one sport added or removed.
Well, I mean, it's no different than the able-bodied model as well. And the challenge that a host organizing committee and a host games organizing committee runs into is size and scope. And so, I mean, I think ideally, well, I don't know about that, but I mean, you can't just grow forever. There's only so much, there are only so many facilities, there's only so much time, there's only so much space that you can cram this in. And there has been an explosion of sport. And so as a host organizing committee member or a governing body collective, whatever it is that's making the decisions as far as what sports are in and which sports are not, you're trying to balance out the desire and the needs and the interest of many different interested parties. And so, you're looking for gender equity. You're looking for, within a Paralympic context, disability equity. You might be looking for equity insofar as types of sports, team sports versus individual sports. You might be trying to balance out new sports versus traditional sports. I mean, there's probably a good dozen different kind of ways by which you're trying to categorize and come up with an equitable platform. And sometimes that means that there are some sports that get asked to step off the list and other sports that get asked to join.
Thank you for joining us on that. What sort of criterias and processes does a sport federation have to go through? And as well, do any of the national Paralympic committees have any say in supporting these sport federations from getting in the games or potentially getting them removed?
Well, okay, let's use para ice hockey as an example. And so para ice hockey is an interesting exemplar because officially it's a co-ed sport. But I think there's been a total of 4 women that have played in Paralympic Games since para ice hockey was an official sport. And I think Lillehammer might have been the first games, in and around 92, 94. And so since then, there's only been 4 women that I'm aware of anyhow that have played in the Paralympic Games in the sport of para ice hockey, which officially is a co-ed sport. So there's clearly, well, not clearly, there's a challenge of enabling women to play on the national para ice hockey teams. So a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Tara Chisholm, is the head coach of the women's para ice hockey team here in Canada, which I'm not 100% sure. I believe is now recognized by Hockey Canada. But that could be a transition process that's taking place. However, women's para ice hockey is not a Paralympic sport. So at the moment, to the best of my understanding, in Italy for the 2026 Paralympic Games, women's para ice hockey will not be a medal sport. And part of the process that's had to take place is for women's para ice hockey to demonstrate that it's not just Canada and the United States, because you can't have a Paralympic Games, you can't have a medal event for only 2 countries, right? Like you have to have a minimum number of countries played on a minimum number of, I believe it's continents, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So there is like a criterion insofar as you need so many countries playing, so many continents that are participating, so many years of having a world championship to demonstrate that it's a broad enough sport so that it can be then added. Because again, the last thing you want to do is have a competition where you only have 2 countries participating. So that creates a kind of a chicken or egg argument, because without it being in the Paralympic Games, then do you have people that are interested in participating without that being the carrot at the end from which to participate? And so it's tricky, because you're trying to encourage kind of both sides. Now, national Paralympic committees can play a role because they are members of the IPC, and the International Paralympic Committee is a member-driven organization. So the Canadian Paralympic Committee has a vote, just like all the other national Paralympic committees. And so that's how they can have influence. And then there are Canadians who are members of committees on the International Paralympic Committee, so they can have influence in that way. And so it just becomes, in many regards, a political process by which to lobby, advocate, and encourage. And then also an administrative one where you're trying to demonstrate that there is a need and a desire. But this was happening at the same time with a multitude of other sports. And so if women's para ice hockey is trying to get on the schedule, there are perhaps 10 other winter sports that are also trying to get on the schedule. And then there are the para winter sports that are already on the schedule who do not want to get bumped off of the schedule. And so they're all somewhat competing amongst themselves to lobby to the decision makers insofar as which sports are added or not added to the game schedule. And so it really comes down to that political process that I made reference to.
And so there's so many different ways I want to go with your response, because it opened up so many different avenues for me. Obviously, citing like the example of the women's para ice hockey, that's one. Nathan and I on the show, we've been talking with members of that group, and how the growth of the sport is really kind of helping them push for that inclusion into the Paralympics. And I think it's such a fascinating sport and conversation around it, because, as you say, technically para ice hockey is open, but it really isn't. It was the same thing with like wheelchair rugby on the summer side, that yes, it's an open sport, but the number of women who are actually on the team or playing is near zero, even with incentivization. Do you think models like where you see with wheelchair curling, where there has to be a mixed setup, makes it more enticing for an organizing committee or someone who is choosing inclusion for certain sports that, okay, they built in gender equity. We don't have to try to cater to maybe two different streams of the sport. It's one that has been set up and designed with gender equity in mind.
And that might be okay and appropriate in some sports and perhaps not in others. And like where a sport, if there's a biological advantage to male versus female or the opposite, then maybe a mixed gender sport doesn't necessarily make sense. In a sport like curling, where you have a team of 4 and you're requiring 2 of one gender and 2 of another gender, then perhaps that's where it works. Then you could further complicate it by, if you were to look at gender from a more fluid perspective, insofar as, well, someone could represent both genders, perhaps even at the same time. And so that's where it maybe from a managerial perspective could get complicated or interesting. But I think that's one way of looking at inclusion within a focus on inclusion. And if you're looking at the gender equitable kind of perspective. And this is where, like the women's para ice hockey is an interesting one, because you're looking at promoting a gender specific sport that then compares to another gender specific sport. So you've got 2 equitable numbers and groups of individuals representing 2 genders, if you were to look at gender from a binary perspective. But what that doesn't take into consideration then is the disability equitable piece of it. And so you've got 2 groups which arguably are primarily either amputation or spinal cord injury. I know in some instances there are people perhaps with cerebral palsy, but it does not take into consideration individuals with a visual impairment. And so that disability then is not included within the inclusion of a women's para ice hockey program. And so does the representation then of individuals with visual impairment by comparison become even less within a Paralympic Winter Games competition? And so this is where it gets complicated, because the pie can only be so big insofar as the numbers of athletes that can compete at the same time. And then you start thinking, well, and athletes with disabilities, certainly going back to the 80s when they created the Commission for the Inclusion of Athletes with a Disability, they were trying to get more disability sports into the Olympic Games. And you can see examples like the Commonwealth Games, which are going to be taking place in Glasgow next summer, where they have events for athletes with disabilities within the larger model that is more traditionally for able-bodied athletes. And by trying to add another disability sport event into an able-bodied traditional schedule, then what gets pulled out? And so I was on the board of the Toronto 2015 oh my goodness, I'm even stumbling over that myself. Pan American Games in Toronto in 2015. And the model that we used there was having 2 separate games, similar to an Paralympic Games. And there was some thought about the opportunity to push them together and to use more of a Commonwealth model, where events for athletes with disability would be in the Pan American able-bodied sport kind of time frame. But that argument only worked if we went from 15 events in the Pan American model to 5 events in a Pan American model. And my thinking at that time anyways, as a board member, was I didn't think it was worth losing the 10 competitive opportunities in order to kind of make that inclusion agreement. Now, I remain perhaps not convinced that was the right decision, but at the time that was the decision that was made, and in part because those 10 competitive events were qualifiers for future Paralympic Games. And so if they weren't hosted then, where would they be held, and how would that then impact, competitive qualifying opportunities for Paralympic Games? So all these things, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not an easy decision. Like, I don't think people just kind of say, yes, we're going to add this and we're going to get rid of that, and that's kind of the end of it. Like, these are tricky, tough, kind of complicated decisions that need to be made.
You mentioned it there, and especially with the sport I compete in cycling, it's really taken strides and steps of having combined competitions, whether it's the 2023 World Championships, having all the indoor track cycling happening, able-bodied and para at the same time, but even the World Championships this past year in 2024 in Zurich for the road being combined. But with a sport like cycling and even alpine skiing, are sports that have been in the games for a long time, but they also have factored combined category events where maybe on the international circuit outside of a games, they're all competing in their one class only. Is there a reason why the IPC has brought down like the event sizes to have all these classes in factors versus just having them racing against their own class?
Yeah, well, I can't speak on behalf of the International Paralympic Committee insofar as why they would or would not. I guess I would guess that, again, it's complicated. Even what is appropriate inclusion and is exclusion or segregation a more appropriate model at certain times? I don't think that's clear. I don't know if there's, kind of a one size fits all argument that everybody agrees on. And so the factor system has its pros and its cons. In some cases, I would think, and again, I might be speaking a little inappropriately and ignorant to how the system works, but a con perhaps could be is just from an audience kind of understanding perspective insofar as who's competing against who and why did that person win and that person not win, and how do we do that? But then, maybe that then just requires greater education of the viewing audience so that they can better understand how that happens. And perhaps in the future, you will see that become more the norm. Again, you have to remember that, the Paralympic Games officially started in the 1960s, but really the modern Paralympic Games began maybe in 1988 in Seoul. And so it's only been 30, 40 years where Paralympic sport, and from an inclusion perspective, and Canada was very much a leader in this. It wasn't until the late 1990s when organizations like Swimming Canada, Archery Canada, and you started seeing the national sport organizations become more inclusive in their thinking. And so again, in that sense, it's only been really 25 years where inclusion in sporting events has happened. And so I think in different sports and different cultural contexts and different geographic contexts, you're seeing different approaches to an inclusion model, but I don't think one has necessarily been recognized as the gold standard. I think we're still trying to figure out where it works and where it doesn't work, and what might work in a cycling perspective in one context may not work in a cycling context in another, and it may not work in a different sport context. And so I think we're still very much in that feeling out stage as far as kind of what style of inclusion in sport works. And I think where it's going to become even further complicated is as technology continues to advance, that line between performance from the person with a disability and a person who is able-bodied, I think, is going to become even narrower. And so, the ability for an individual, not in every case, but in some cases with a disability, to compete equitably and completely against the person who's able-bodied, I don't think we're that far away from that, again, in some disability contexts. And so I think that will further blur the lines insofar as what's an inclusive event versus what's just an event.
No, it's a very fascinating conversation. I want to take things to the exclusion side. When a sport is removed from the Paralympics, and it's happened from the early stages of the original Paralympic Games to even the modern context in the last kind of a few cycles. What impact does it have on those parasports when they are no longer kind of a part of the Paralympic program? Like you look at things like sailing or seven-a-side, football, wrestling, weightlifting, things like that. Like, how have you seen those sports impacted when they are removed from the Paralympic program?
Well, I mean, Paralympic sport, with, again, a few exceptions, are like they teeter kind of just on their solvency. Like there aren't many that have such deep, broad-based participation pathways where, they'll just continue regardless of, kind of what happens. And in some cases, the carrot of being in the Paralympic Games is significant. And it's enough of a carrot to encourage individuals to get involved, for governments to fund them. And that may actually be the biggest impact, is that, again, if a sport is no longer on the Paralympic program, does that then mean that it's no longer funded by its national governing body. And, globally, this will vary. But if that's the case, again, with only a few exceptions, Paralympic sports don't have deep pockets with, huge sponsorship opportunities. And so they rely quite heavily on government largesse. And if that's no longer happening because sports no longer on the Paralympic Games, I think that can have a significant impact. And as well, I mean, if you're an individual who has a certain disability and you've got maybe 6 sports that you are interested in participating, 4 of them ultimately are played in the Paralympic Games and 2 of them are not. And maybe, again, even if you're newly starting out, it may not necessarily be what you want to do for sure, but it might be something you want to do is participate in Paralympic Games. Well, then you might choose one of those 4 sports where there is a Paralympic pathway as opposed to the 2 where there's not. And so I think that's where you can see it having an influence. And then it becomes a bit of a success breeding success, because if you're not on the Paralympic Games, you're not getting the marketing and the broadcast and the sponsorship opportunities, because you're just not on people's radar. And then it's hard to get back onto the radar in order to then get back onto the Paralympic Games schedule to then benefit from that success. So I can see where sports are very much concerned when they're being considered for not being on the Paralympic Games schedule. And I'm empathetic to that.
Would there be any sports that you would like to see make a return, whether it was a demonstration sport or it had previously been in the Games?
When I was the president of the Canadian Paralympic Committee, I would often get asked questions, not exactly like that, but similar to that, where you're asked to kind of pick, a sport. It's a bit like saying, oh, which of your 3 sons is your favorite? And so it's tricky to answer that, but one popped to mind right away. And it's in a Winter Games context, and it was ice picking. And it was in the Nagano Games, 1998, as a demonstration event. And I believe it was in previous Winter Paralympic Games as well. But I don't think it was in Salt Lake City in 2002. But to me, it would be a natural opportunity, because speed skating is in the Olympic Games. We have venues for speed skating that are built for the Olympic Games. So the venue is already there. And quite honestly, they wouldn't require a lot of adaptations to the facility. It could be a relatively inexpensive sporting event for individuals. The difficulty would be is that in my recollection anyways, it was only for individuals with either amputations or spinal injuries. But you could make adaptations for it to be multi-disability. And so again, it could be a multi-disability style. It could use an existing facility that would not be used otherwise for a Winter Paralympic Games. So the ovals tend not to get used in the Winter Paralympic Games otherwise. So you got a venue that's basically sitting empty anyhow. It's one that's relatively easy entry for participants, I would argue. And there could be cross-training opportunities for people who have been playing para-ice hockey. So that was one that just kind of popped into my head as an example of maybe one in a winter context.
And obviously, too, with that also being a winter sport, there is that value, because there is a far more narrow a slate of sports and competitions on the Winter Paralympic side than opposed to the Summer Paralympic side.
I mean, I know like bobsled has tried to get onto the Winter Paralympic schedule multiple times too. I do have some friends and colleagues who participate here in Calgary, and so I'm empathetic to them just because I know them. And I know that, they are very passionate about trying to get the sport on the schedule. And I think that would be a neat opportunity too. But again, like that's just because I happen to know those individuals, that there's a personal relationship. And so I'm cognizant that there could be arguments for a long list of other sports that are more deserving perhaps of getting on the schedule for any variety of reasons that perhaps I don't know about.
But bobsledding too is one I know me and Nathan have talked about, and that's one sport I've been following for years, and I've always been kind of keeping my eyes like that would be so great to have on the Winter Paralympics, for the same reason as you say, you already have the tracks, you already have the facilities on the Olympic side. you can draw in a new audience, new sport on the Paralympic side. So, Dr. David Legg, thank you so much. This has been fascinating again. We'll obviously have another conversation with you in the future. We always love it. We always learn so much. Thank you so much for your time.
You are most welcome. Happy to anytime.
That was our conversation with Dr. David Legg, former president of the CPC and a professor at Mount Royal University. Nathan, tons of different ways we can go with that conversation, but what were some of the biggest takeaways for you?
Dr. David Legg is always an incredible speaker, and just hearing his wealth of knowledge and just really breaking down different sports, breaking down how the IPC looks at selections, but also the importance of that federation and really that sport equity and that sport equality is so important, even now where a lot of sports that we talk about on the program that aren't in the Paralympics yet, that are hopefully going to be there in the near future, are really trying to grow that base, are really trying to get different countries' involvements to really help boost and help show. And even especially one that we talk about all the time, and we spoke a lot earlier in the conversation with Dr. David Legg, is about women's para ice hockey and how they're still really trying to grow that program, and who knows what that's going to look like down the road. But is there any takeaways that you have from that conversation with Dr. David Legg?
Yeah, I think he made a really clear case for how nuanced and complicated the decision making is. It's not just, oh, we're tired of this sport. Oh, this one country keeps winning it. No. It's like, okay, what is obviously the competition level? How many countries, how many different nations all over the world are actually competitive and representing and sending athletes in this sport? What is the gender equity side of things? What is the disability range and equity side of things? Is it just one very specific disability classification that can compete in this sport? Or is it a bit more open? Is it a bit more broad for competition? I thought that was very fascinating because you have to weigh all those things, and him talking about women's para ice hockey. Whoa, it is technically an open sport, but the opportunities have never been there for women, so maybe you do have to look at a gender-specific classification. So I thought that was all fascinating. I also just find it very kind of stark how the clear impact, if a sport is in the Paralympics or not in the Paralympics, it ripples throughout the whole kind of structure and foundation of that sport, whether it's just people going to be going into it just because maybe they want to try or have the opportunity on a Paralympic pathway. Maybe the countries don't support it. Maybe the NSOs don't support it or recognize it. So it has such a ripple effect if a sport is removed from the games, and there have been a number that have.
Oh, there's been plenty of games that have been removed. And even for research on this episode and this conversation with Dr. David Legg, you and I were looking at a bunch of sports that were either demonstration sports, but also had been in the games and then have been removed. Was in that research any sport that really stuck out to you that you would love to learn more about, or maybe even see hopefully back at a games one day?
Well, so the one that I came across that I thought was quite humorous, dartry. So it's a weird combination of darts and archery. That was one of those early Paralympic sports. I'm just more out of curiosity for that. But for a demonstration sport, I would love to see parasurfing. It's one that's really fascinating. There seems to be a wide range of disability classifications, and it was a demonstration sport already. Bring it in to the fold. Let's have parasurfing. What about you, Nathan, before we wrap?
I think parasurfing is definitely up there for me, but one that really sticks out, and Dr. David Legg even brought it too, was ice picking or para ice hockey or para sledge is a very interesting sport that had its moment, and as we talked about, has the infrastructure of the arenas, of the venues, but for some reason it has not gained that traction to get back into a game. So I would love to see parasledge, but there's so many others that we could talk about, and there's so many that we've mentioned in the past on this show that we'd love to talk about and chat about, but I think that's it for time. So for Alex Smyth and myself.
Yeah, we'll have to save it for another day, Nathan. That's the end of the show, end of the sports talk for now. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Parasport Nation. Like and subscribe to the channel to follow us now.